And then the second part to your question, which is about, how do you monetize something? I think it's what you were getting at.
Right. So eventually everything ends up being monetized, right? You need something for the company to keep running and doing what it does. So do you think at some point every company just comes to that point where they need to listen to profits over ethics?
So I can't speak for every company.
Right.
It depends on how they choose to monetize. Advertising is one path that many companies have taken towards monetization. That's been a really interesting path because it was one that advertising doesn't have that much regulation. It's shocking how little regulation there is in advertising. Maybe, one approach is if there was more regulation in advertising, that might have different outcomes. It's hard to say unless we try it, unless somebody dares enough to try to regulate the advertising industry. When you don't use advertising, you end up using some types of other models. You could crowdfund something. You can use a subscription model. There have been cases where the advertising model has not had the intended consequences. And we've seen that in many social media sites. And we've also seen infrastructures around advertising that have violated the laws. So for example, there are laws that say that you cannot discriminate, you cannot target, race, gender, ethnicity around loans, housing, or job applications. And it's been found in many social media sites that advertisements were going directly to these groups of people.
Right.
And so because of that, that clearly violated a law, caused some disparity. It's hard to measure exactly how much, but it did definitely cause disparity. And it reinforces certain stereotypes. So I think that causes harm. I would be interested in seeing how policy experts would want to regulate advertising, because I think that would be an interesting path to pursue, at least in some small segment, to see how it works out, and then to move forward from that. Some companies have moved on to being B corporations, trying to try something new there. But I do think that when a company, whether it's social media company or not, any company, when they have shareholders and they have to make a decision about when they have money, whether to give it to shareholders or to reinvest to make a product that's better for the people to use it, I do think that there needs to be some more thinking in place and possibly some more regulation, that if you have a company that affects, millions of people, that you don't only put your money back to the shareholders, and you have to think about what happens to, the people that use your tool. And again, I can't emphasize this enough, the vulnerable people that use your tool, because oftentimes they're the ones that suffer the most. So this idea of, let's say you have this income, how do you reinvest it? There are shareholders, there are, many people who use your tools, and then there are your advertisers who are also your clients. And so there's this complicated dynamic that you kind of have to tease apart about who you satisfy. And there is no, one right answer. But what I do know that needs to happen is that, especially with respect to advertising, the level of profiling that happens needs to be addressed to a certain degree, especially in those three areas that I mentioned: loans, jobs, and housing. That is critical. That we don't discriminate, because that's a violation of the Federal Housing Act and many civil rights laws that we have today. And that type of advertising is still happening today. With other forms of advertising, it's a crazy world. In many of these situations, you just need to put in these ads, and you only need like one hit in like 10,000 for a company to make a profit. At the same time, there are benefits to advertising, right? We can get access to things for free, at the expense of, certain, amounts of data about ourselves. So I would strongly recommend to you and to your listeners this book called Surveillance Capitalism, by Shoshana Zuboff. It's an excellent book that details the intricacies of what happened to our online world once we went down the path of using advertising as a model for revenue. And it's fascinating to look at it from the different perspectives that she talks about, and how difficult it is to go back once you go down that road.
Interesting.